And there we go. So, welcome again. Thank you so much, Macaulay, for being here with us. I really appreciate your time. And as a person who works in a startup environment, I know how hectic it can be and how busy people can get. So, thank you. We really appreciate you being here. For those who don't know me, I'm Linda, and thank you for coming to this Chat and Learn event with Power to Fly. These are events where we bring people like Macaulay, who is an entrepreneur, to share with us the knowledge and to teach us something today. So please participate, ask questions. If something that you want to share, if any stories you would like to share, feel free. We are here, and it's like more a community. We're not here to work. We're not a business meeting. We are here just to learn. So don't worry about that. Don't worry about being correct or saying the right thing. We don't have such things here. And with that, I would like to present you Macaulay, and she's going to talk to us today about startup ecosystem and how we can find the best fit there. Macaulay, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Linda. And hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here as well and talk about one of my favorite types of organizations, which is in startups. I've been involved with a variety of different types of startups for many years now, ranging from ones that I've started on my own to others that I've consulted with, big, small, etc. And I love how invested people are in the startup community and how interested they are. I also feel like startups can be a little challenging to join as a first timer and also challenging to navigate even when you've been in the system for a while. So what I'm hoping for today's talk is to be able to demystify some of that process, to think about what are some of the aspects that you will be paying attention to when you're trying to think about what working with or for a startup would be like, and to break that down a little bit into some tangible elements that you could take forwards if or should you want to join a startup in the future or to start your own. As Linda said, I'm happy to keep this as informal and social. So I've tried to break it down into digestible content, and I've certainly saved room for Q&A at the end. But if you have questions as they come up, please feel free to flag in the chat, and we can kind of address them as they go along as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, awesome. So we're going to kick this off. So like I said, I'm gearing today's talk towards if you're thinking about joining or rejoining a startup. There's been a lot of focus and discussion around creating your own startup, which is phenomenal. And I'm always happy to talk about that, probably in a different lecture about what that means. But it's also equally exciting to join someone else's startup, either as an early stage employee or later stage employee. And it really has different dynamics than if you're creating your own or if you're joining a more established business. And because startups are really varied, working in one and transitioning to another can be a really big and new experience. There are a lot of dynamics to consider. Before we dive in about what those are, I also just wanted to share a little bit of myself so you know where I'm coming from. Everything is context dependent. I've tried to make this as objective as possible, but I've obviously not worked with every startup there ever is. So you'll get a sense of where my experience lies, and I'll be forthright about where some of my gaps are to help you form your own impressions. So I'm currently the COO of SurgiBox Inc. We're an MIT and Harvard spin-off company building ultra-portable medical devices. So we're doing real products, going through the manufacturing cycle, hands-on, also working with regulatory, which is a little bit of a different flavor than you'll get from some tech startups or some software as a service startups where you don't have a physical product. In addition to working for SurgiBox, I also mentor for companies going through MIT's Delta V Accelerator, future companies that are going through MIT Sloan. I've consulted for several different startups over the past 5 years, most of them with an international focus, with ranging in a lot of different services, from developing clean cook stoves to licensing digital art to working on consulting services. And in a prior life, I was also a researcher on startup growth strategies and the team dynamics that play into that. So I've really tried to attack the startup world from a couple of different angles, and I'm going to break that down for you here today. What I mean by attacking the startup world from a bunch of different angles is that startups can vary so wildly, which feels pretty intuitive, but a lot of the news and exposure that you'll get will be most likely around tech startups. They are more likely to make a big splash. They're also a little bit easier to start up, to get that going, because you can create a product, rapidly iterate. You're not going through, to use our own example, like FDA and regulatory. So the life cycle process churns a little bit faster and attracts more news. But there's a huge range of startups in terms of what products they're creating, where in the world they are based, how big their team is, what do they look like. And even within that broad list of categories, so you can think about physical product startups, you can think about tech or software as a service, even within those, because startups are usually so unique to the founding team, and that's one of the big draws, they can present themselves really differently and be completely different experiences to work in depending on what your preferences are. When people talk about startups, and if someone was going to tell you about yours, they usually do so in 3 categories. And I'm sure you guys have seen this before. They'll talk about the number of people in the startup, they'll talk about how old the company is, and they'll usually talk about the level of funding that they've received. This is super useful from an investor standpoint, and this is why that conversation goes in that direction. It tells them 3 quick facts about where they are as a stage of a company to give them some sense of whether or not they're going to be profitable and invest-worthy. Whether or not those 3 characteristics and data points actually do that, I think is a little debated, but that's how you'll usually hear people talk about, hi, we're a 5-person company, 2 years old, just finished Series A. What those numbers don't tell you is what it's like to work in the startup. It gives you a really interesting synopsis. They might even say what the startup does, but in hearing those, it doesn't really give you a good sense of what it means. You could have a Series A startup with 1 person. You could have a Series A startup with 12 or 200, or never go through a Series A and be a 1,000-person company. And you could be rapidly iterating. You could be fairly traditional. None of those metrics are going to give you the information that you need to understand if this is something that you want to work for. And I noticed that we have a question up on the chat. Okay. Sorry, I'm switching between screens. So if you have a question, it might also be worthwhile to unmute yourself just so I notice that they're happening.
I'm here to. So thank you so much.
No, thank you, Linda. So the 3 steps that I really think are critical when you're trying to assess whether or not you want to join a startup, or if you want to join a startup, are to understand the role flexibility, to define the level of chaos, and to assess your own risk appetite. And I'm going to break each of these down into further categories. So what do I mean when I say understand role flexibility? You might know this on an intuitive level if you've read any job descriptions for startups, because it's a fairly common terminology. But the role may or may not be clearly defined. This could be because the company culture is really casual, that they're in a period of discovery, invention, that they really just need people, generalist people, and they don't have a specific skill set. Or it could be that they're not really prepared as a company. So when you're looking at that job description or talking to a startup, they're not going to be able to say, these are the 3 items that you will be in charge of. This is what your day-to-day works like. You usually hear, oh, your day-to-day will be really varied, or here are the high-level things that you'll be focused on, all of which will give you a sense of what you're working on. If you're an operational expert, they'll be able to usually tell you which areas of operations you're working on. If you are a marketing expert, they'd say, hey, we want you to run our social media, but they're not going to have the breakdown of specific tasks, structures, and even hierarchy that you'll usually see in different companies. So it might be more challenging to understand who you're reporting to. What does that reporting structure look like? And to really assess before entering what your role in that community is going to look like. How this might play out, and I say potential because, like all things, like startups are human and the people within them are human, and so things do vary, but some of the more commonalities that could come out with an undefined role is the ability to explore different company areas. So if they don't have a specific, go ahead, Linda.
I'm sorry. I just I thought somebody had their microphone on. Oh, okay.
I heard a little bit of feedback as well.
Yeah, please, Macaulay, please continue. I already see this, and you have no idea how much I can relate. I was thinking at the moment you're saying about like the job description and how that can be like to externally and how what actually is. And I think that people in startups, they shape their roles because they don't have someone to report to. There's not like a let's say a traditional structure and with hierarchy, but everybody's working in so many different areas, and it becomes like this. And so I would love to hear like more of the dynamics here, and how can that work eventually effectively and we have results.
Yeah, absolutely, Linda. And exactly to your point, like startups may not have the role definition because they are often exploratory. Some startups will. And so it's useful to think about the fact that things might apply to general startups, but they might actually have a clear definition. It could be because they're very decided in what they need for a role, like that is clear to them. Or it could be that they are, to put it bluntly, like very well organized. They have that foresight. The trajectory of their company is clear. So it's not to say that all startups are acting undefined. That is probably more common, but there are areas in which you could find a defined role. And so that depends on what you're looking for. So the dynamics that you could expect if the role is undefined is you can explore different company areas. If they're not quite sure exactly what they want you to do, you might have a general skill set and you might be able to grow within that or try out different areas related to your skill sets likely within the company. So if you're head of marketing or engaged in marketing, maybe you work on some publications, maybe you work on some speech writing. A lot of people have multi-skill sets, and if your job description is not locked down, you can explore those. It also means you could potentially have ownership of your job direction. In that exploration, if the company does not necessarily know what they want, you can push in those areas in the ways that you necessarily want them to. It also could mean that you've got ambiguity in your professional direction. So if they're not sure what they want from you, they will not be able to give you that clear picture, at least not in a more structured time frame of, hey, you spend 2 years here, then you get promoted, and then you go to the next position, and this is what your trajectory looks like. They might not even be able to tell you what they want you to do in the day-to-day. So it does become very exploratory. So that involves self-definition of what the role looks like, rapid onboarding, slightly switching. All of those are some things that you can expect if their vision isn't clear, because then you're trying to implement or to understand what their vision could look like. Lauren, I see your question regarding interviewing at startups and what they would need from a tech writer. I think that that's a challenging dynamic. And so I'd want if you can expand upon that, handling that in terms of, do you want to continue to engage with them, or are you trying to not interview with companies who don't necessarily know what they want? Because those, I think, would change that answer.
I really actually like the idea of being able to like have some autonomy in figuring out what it is that they need from a tech writer. Like that actually excites me. I think I was recently at a previous job where like I was kind of very much forced to do certain tasks, and I was like be able to like, because I manage my own. But I just want to make sure it's like you guys are going to need me 6 months. Right? I'm not going to be able to decide like we don't need tech writer. Like that's the big thing.
I can hear you a little bit, but I think I have the gist. If I don't answer that question, feel free to follow up additionally over chat. But what I think the best way, if you enjoy that type of engagement, is to explore that possibility with them and be proactive about it. So if they're not necessarily sure what they want, ask them what their pain points are, ask them where their structure is going, and then try to illustrate where you could go within that. Because maybe they see the need in 2 months, but they don't need to hire you right now. Or maybe they have a need, but they're looking for someone who could fill kind of multiple roles because none of them are a part-time. So be proactive in connecting those dots for them and saying, hey, you said that you have this pain point. I think I could resolve it this way. Or, hey, I've heard of other companies. You likely have this pain point. Is that true? If so, I could do that. So do some of the heavy lifting for them because they might not know what they want, or they might be a little overwhelmed. I do think overwhelmed is usually a word that's applied to startups. I'll touch upon that later. It can good and bad depending on what you enjoy within a company. But I think the more that you can take that direction and be proactive, the more likely that you would be able to engage with them before they've already realized that they have that. I can say in the companies that I've been a part of, oftentimes when we are realizing our needs, we reach back into our old connections, either people that we've worked with before, but for a different skill set, or people we've come into contact with, and we say, hey, you did X for us. We think that you might be great for Y. Do you have any interest in that? And so that does make things a little more challenging when trying to bring in new people. What this means, this role ambiguity and this role flexibility, and that's in hierarchy, reporting, definition, tasks. What you should do is think about your working style and how you would respond. Some people love this. It's exciting. You get to make your own way up as you go along. You don't really have a clear report structure. Everyone's kind of chiming in this fluid way. Some people find this really frustrating. Most people will have a little bit of both. And so you want to kind of figure out where you're at right now, what you're looking, and where on that gradient of flexibility is that job. Do they have some sort of definition, some sort of company direction? Are they really just saying, hey, this is where we're at, go nuts? And try to look about that spectrum and where you're at. Are you at a time where you can be ambiguous? Do you think that they would support you as you're going through that exploratory process? Or are you just going to feel kind of left alone and frustrated with what you're doing? Team dynamics, team support, as well as team location can really help. Particularly during the pandemic, one of the things that's come up is that people are being onboarded remotely. And so areas where they would be talking with their colleagues or explore or kind of get that job description aren't necessarily happening as fluidly. And so that's generating more frustration than excitement because people are feeling stuck. They're like, I want to work, I want to engage, I'm uncertain how. So think about that for you. There isn't a wrong answer. And that's true for all of these things. It's not saying these startups are bad and these startups are good. It's saying here are the things that you should think about in terms of what will be the best fit for you and what you want right now, because those change.
Macaulay, also, like, I really love that, because I can see, like, working in a startup, many people feel alone because they have loads of things to do and that frustrates them. And others feel excitement and energized and so eager to start doing stuff. What I find very helpful, and I really understand that the team dynamic is to support each other and have like one-on-one calls and relate and say, hey, this is all right, that you are not less for not understanding everything. We are all trying to do our best here. And I find this very helpful to increase the morale of the team and people to understand that we are all together in this mission. And it's not like, somebody has lots of work and they cannot go through and the other ones are just not doing anything. And there's the dynamic. Personally, and I think also Lorraine, I'm in the middle. I just might go like frustration on the one side and, say like, oh my God, we are on fire. We're on fire. Run, run. And then the other day is like, this is great. We are doing amazing stuff. And guys, like, feel free to relate if you have like similar stories or questions. But from a personal perspective, this is like how I've experienced this dynamic.
Yeah, I think that's really accurate, Linda, and I appreciate you sharing. And most people will be somewhere in the middle. No one likes to be told exactly what to do, but no one really likes to be dropped off in the middle of the ocean and being told to swim to land. So you're going to try to find within there. And as exactly you mentioned out, there are dynamics that come into play, like how deep is your skill set that you feel that you can take independent action? How closely are you working with your colleagues? Like all of those are along that spectrum. And to answer that, like, here are some of the questions that you can ask when engaging with the company to understand what that dynamic looks like and where on that spectrum. So ask, what work streams would I be expected to own? See how granular they are. Understand how tasks are delegated between team members, because that lets you know, is this based on availability? Is this based on skill set? Is everyone collaborating on everything, which will speak to the working structure? How do you see the company's needs shifting in the future? Maybe they really need a tech writer right now, but in 3 months, they're going to need a social media strategist. Understand what that looks like so you can proactively put yourself in there, or so that you're not looking for a job 3 to 6 months down the line because their needs are shifted and you don't like where your new career direction is had. And then ask what the reporting structure looks like. And some of the answers that you will likely hear, and I've called them out, and like I said, these are not good or bad, but they're things to know, and I'm going to help to interpret what they mean. You'll likely say here, we expect people to wear a lot of hats. Now that can be a good thing or a bad thing. As a generalist, I'm used to wearing a lot of hats, and sometimes I enjoy it. But it can also be a bit of a code for, we expect you to do 3 jobs in 1. So be aware of that. Those hats that they're asking you to wear, do they not have the ability to hire multiple people? Or are they really looking for someone who can do a little bit of everything within one full-time role? Because that's important. Are they asking you to shift between tasks, or they're asking you to take on too many tasks? So dive within that. Understanding task delegation by availability, that's a pretty common response. So that kind of speaks to the fact that the whole team is generalist, or a lot of the team is generalist, because they're not matching skill sets. So that does mean an extra level of fluidity and flexibility. And then finally, flat structure. So this one I have some particular thoughts about, because there is no flat structure. I have yet to encounter it. Some are flatter than others, but that's not really going to tell you what you need to know. There is always going to be some sort of hierarchy, but it's understanding, is that formal or is that informal? So you'll want to know who is working with who is reporting to who makes those decisions at the end of the day. And they should be able to tell you that. It might not be formal, they might not have an org chart, but if they're not able to, then that might call into question how they're making decisions, and you'd want to understand that. Because they can't say, this is who decides on X, this is who decides on Y. How are they making decisions? You want to be aware of, is this group consensus? Does it actually all go to the CEO, but no one wants to mention it? It's something to be aware of. So moving on to the next one, but I'll take a second to see if there were any questions. So defining the level of chaos. This is
excitement, not questions, pure excitement to see what are we going to face in the level of chaos, Macaulay. Like I can relate so much. I'm waiting for this bit.
Well, this is a personal favorite of mine, because I think it goes counter to a lot of least of the American perceptions of startups, which is that there is always chaos. It's always running around, which I want to emphasize is not necessarily true. It can be true, but I wouldn't let that deter you. If you are looking for a startup, that does not have to, don't accept chaos as the default. So it's all right if it's there, but investigate. Because that goes into what energizes you. Do you love a crisis? Does your heart get fast? Does that make you excited? Do you want to feel energized to work and it focuses you? Or do you get frustrated? Like, do you say, like, I really don't feel like putting out a fire. I want to, like, keep my heart rate level, do my work, have my plan. And because there is this expectation of chaos within startups, it's not going to be seen as usually an operational failure if there are a lot of fires. It could be seen as the company culture. And so you, like everything, it's on a spectrum, understand where is that and what does that look like? Because that's going to play into not only how do you respond during working hours, but also what's the expectation for outside of working hours. I think one of the common perceptions that I've heard within the startup community, particularly out on the West Coast, is if you're not working on your startup 20 hours a week, what are you doing? I have a lot of problems with that as a personal and a professional level, because I think that doesn't necessarily mean that you are working effectively, that your startup is doing well. All that it means is that you and your company are not getting a lot of sleep and you probably hate your lives. Then again, some people get energized that, but it's not the norm. It doesn't have to be the norm. So think about, is that a culture that you want to be a part of for however long that you want to be a part of it? Do you have the bandwidth to support that? And what are their expectations? So the questions to ask to kind of understand how they operate is, what does the typical project cycle look like? Try to understand, is everything a 2-week turnaround? How much notice is there? What does a sprint look like? Because that's a very common word as well. How would you describe the company working style? Companies want to tell you about their culture, and culture is this broad heading, but break it down. What does culture mean when you're on a team and there is a task? How often is there a rush to get a deliverable? Because that's going to tell you what that quick turnaround looks like. And how would you describe the company's ability to pivot or respond to new opportunities? This one's slightly different than rush work, because it also means, like, how often is the company going to shift what it asks? And depending on the nimbleness of the startup, and nimble is often seen as a good thing, it could mean they're changing strategic directions. They're changing their project. Sometimes that's by design, sometimes because that sees an opportunity. But you want to understand how quickly they can turn on a dime, because that's going to be impacting not only your work style, but also potentially your role. Lauren, you make a great point. Bigger companies also operate with chaos. Absolutely. Chaos can appear in any different sense. And startups, I mean, often people think of a 5 to 10 person company, like all working out of one room. I've seen companies of 1,000 people call themselves a startup. So you want to, and they obviously have a lot of, or they can have a lot of chaos as well. So you want to understand what their response is to chaos, and are they working to get it better? because there also is that stage between that 5-person company and that 1,000-person company. If that 5-person company is still figuring out the ropes, yeah, maybe, but they understand this is where we need to get better. That's something to keep in mind. If it's a 1,000-person company and they are still operating under chaos, they're probably going to continue. That's probably what they want. And so think about, what is your tolerance for change? Do you want to help resolve this chaos long-term, or do you want to be responding to it?
I have a question on that, Carly. Like, I really understand that. Like, they are like companies, like they call themselves startups, like having like a few people, but they're also companies like they have 900 employees and they still call themselves startups. And there, like, what is like somebody who wants to get a job there? And so like they have like 900 employees and they still are calling them startups. So is this like what we can expect, like it's the company culture now, like to live in this chaotic system and like operate like this? Or because people are just looking at these big companies that they have like a name now, but they are startups, and they say, okay, I'm gonna find them structure, or I'm gonna find the startup chaos.
Yeah, that's really important. It's a great question, Linda. There isn't, I would say, a universally accepted definition of a startup because companies can present so differently. So you can have a 6-person consulting organization that's fully formed and been around for 20 years. They probably won't call themselves a startup, but maybe for 10 years, they might still, that really just has no aspirations to grow bigger. They don't need to, or their product doesn't need to. I mean, WhatsApp was considered a startup up until they were bought and they were under 40 people. Or you could have a company, let's give an example, that relies on a lot of call volume. And they could have 900 people and 800 of those could be outsourced callers, but they still count them under their bandwidth or under their employees. Or you could have a company that's 1,000 people and they like the name startup and they just decide to hang on to it. So the definition could change based on how they see their funding, how they see their culture. And so this is what part of what these questions are for, because it goes back to the variety of startups and what people could label themselves as. So yeah, team size is one indication and funding is one indication, but startup is also a mentality. And so yeah, you want to understand, like, when you call yourself a startup, what are you really saying? Are you saying that you're growing fast? Are you saying that you're chaotic? Are you saying that you have expectations of being billionaires? Dive down into what that looks like, because those first 3 factors, funding, size, and age, are not really going to tell you how they work. On the chaos, the areas to note that are going to be like key signalers of what this looks like within the organization. Some of them are the experience of the leadership team. I don't know if any of you guys have worked with interns before, but I remember being an intern and thinking that I knew everything, or not everything, but a lot. And now, many years later, I work with interns and I'm like, oh, I have to teach them how's the best way to send an email, when to proactively communicate. There are things that you just learn by doing. And that is true for experience of the leadership team. If they've worked in businesses before, they're going to pull some of those practices from those businesses. Some of them might be great. Some of them might not be. It might be a little bit more formal, but you also might have review systems. They might know how to send emails in a very professional sense, but they also might require like 48 hours response reply. Like, there will be something within that, but they'll have some knowledge of how to run a company before. And usually you get better when you do things. So if they have some experience either in startups or in industry, things might run a little bit smoother, particularly if that experience is within the sector that they're engaging in. But they'll know how to manage teams. They'll know how to prioritize their own work. And that's going to make things less chaotic, particularly if it's among the C-suite. Another area to note is that term that I used, putting out fires. That is common. You'll see it on a JD. You'll hear it in interviews. Dive into that. Say, okay, how often do these fires occur? When they occur, how big are they? What's causing them? What are we doing to mitigate them? Everything is going to have a fire. It's just whether or not they're working to change the frequency of those fires speaks to their chaos level. Or it could be a responsive company. I mean, if you're working in an organization or you're interested in an organization that responds to other organizations, like a crisis management, they're always going to have fires. That's their job. So understand what that spectrum looks like. The other things to note are the administrative system. So there's some areas that you really never want to get messed up. Your payroll system is one of those. Your manager reporting relationship, your performance review. You want those to be stable. In the areas where most people want their chaos is in the innovation, in the company response, in the external, the fun things, the bones of the company. you kind of want to be solid. So see what those look like, or are those still in development? And your recruitment process is going to be a great example, because that is an administrative system. Are people responding? Are they on time? Did they leave you hanging for 3 weeks and then get back to you? Did they remember your name? Like I said, none of those are deal breakers, particularly if you're being brought in to be a part of those systems, but they're going to speak to the foundation of the company. Because if you're trying to figure out how to work ADP in your payroll system and that blows up every month, you're going to have less time trying to build your own product. And so that's the type of chaos you usually want to stay away from. And then finally, the area to note is, how is your potential role going to be impacted? So maybe they are still working on their admin systems, but you're going to be like on their sales team and you're not really going to interact. Maybe that doesn't bother you. Maybe the chaos will be mitigated. Maybe you are actually going to be on that team and you're going to be having to respond to it every time. So there could be chaos in one level of the company that doesn't reach you. And so that's important to keep in mind. And then finally, the third step is assessing your risk appetite. And this, I think, is a little bit more well talked about, but it's still important to note. So assessing your risk appetite means thinking about, what does this mean if I join this company? What does that risk look like from a financial perspective for me? So the two factors within there are the company longevity and the compensation plan. Now, compensation plan gets a lot of attention, and rightly so. I will be spending some time on that. But longevity is also really important, because you could have the best compensation plan in the world. If the company lasts for only 2 more months, you are still going to have to job search in a little bit. So we're going to focus on that one first. So the company longevity depends on their potential, their idea, their product, as well as their plan. So potential is more ambiguous, because they're going to believe in what they're doing. They should. If they don't, ask some questions. But you are going to have to assess, how valid is their belief? Is there a market? Is this going to continue? And that's going to be a judgment call. You can look up some articles, you can do research, you can talk to them, but at the end of the day, that is ambiguous. It's not defined. But the company plan is different. So the company plan, actually, I'm going to go back one, speaks to what they want for the company. How long is it going to run? Are they looking to do a quick turnaround 2-month app that they sell right away and then go on to the next thing? Are they in it for the long haul and they're developing drugs? Because there are pharmaceutical startups, and for them, a drug cycle takes 10 years. Understand what their organizational plan is. And that's often not asked about in interviews, and it is absolutely acceptable to do that. So areas to explore for longevity is to understand if they're currently generating revenue. Some of these questions can feel delicate, and you obviously want to ask appropriately, but they're also useful to know as someone looking to join this company. Are they generating revenue? If not, do they have any plans for future funding rounds? What is their 5-year strategy? What is their current runway? I've flagged that as a delicate question because it is specifically asking them, how much cash do you have? So use that one wisely, but it's important to know, and you'll figure that out when they talk about revenue and funding. If they're fundraising in the moment when you talk to them, understand what that risk profile looks like. And then ultimately understand what success looks for them. Are they looking for an IPO, a merger, an exit? Because all that's going to speak to not only their needs, which touches base on some of that role definition earlier, but also how long they're going to be around and how long they're going to expect you to be around or hope that you're around. And then
I have a question.
Absolutely.
So have you experience from your career, companies like startups, blooming and then suddenly after 1 or 2 years not existing anymore? And how does that look like? And as candidates and people who are working in a startup, what would we expect as working startup employees, if the company doesn't exist tomorrow?
Well, that will speak ideally to the level of risk and the level of communication within the leadership team. So you should have a sense of the organization you're joining, of what is their current risk. Are they at risk of collapsing overnight, like WOW Airlines? Or are they going to have some advance warning? And what is the communication around that? So, and that is going to speak to not just the culture, but the integrity and of the leadership team. Are they going to give some notice? Hey guys, we're winding down. You're not going to have answers for those. Like, unfortunately, no one's going to read you their integrity as a leader, but you're going to have a sense of whether or not, and see how they treat people, see how they're communicative about the other aspects, about their operational statistics, about their financial runway. Some of these things you're going to learn maybe after you've signed and you're going on, but it's important to kind of stay aware and think about that.
You being always aware.
Yes, absolutely. And then Lauren, to your question, it is sometimes easier to job search if you get laid off rather than the company went under. It can also be a little less, you have a little less notice depending on how long they give. I also think that depending on the type of company, and because it's more common for people to change jobs, that is seen as less of a red flag, depending on how you do it. So it's not unusual to know, or I think it's fairly accepted, that startups can be chaotic, that they can be poorly run, which is at the far end of the spectrum of chaotic, or that the role's definition can be wrong. And it's all right to be upfront about that, especially if the startup is a small team, because in those personalities matter a lot. So no, if you're hopping every 3 months, someone is definitely going to say, like, either something's up with you or your filter is wrong for joining these organizations. And you do want to be cautious of that. But it's also clear to say, I wasn't a good fit. Here is why. But this is how I've changed. And this is why I think you're going to be a good fit for your organization. And I think that that's a perfectly reasonable way to go about that, as long as you are honest and rational. Like, if you haven't put in that learning process to explain why your filter is now better for that organization, there are going to be some questions. Also, career pivots are a thing. So if you say, look, I joined as a quality specialist, they no longer need a quality specialist. They asked for me to become a regulatory manager. And I said, no, thank you. That makes sense as well, because the needs are shifting, as we spoke about earlier, and that's a little more expected. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, although it could be challenging. And then on to compensation. Now, compensation, I think, is touched about a little bit more, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention it here. There are a lot of smaller items, but the 3 biggest ones are base salary, equity, and benefits. So base salary, you are going to get a number, and how to negotiate and get that number is a whole separate talk that I know Power to Fly has put on before. And so I would encourage you to check them out. But some of the questions that you'd want to know specifically for startups is, what is the possibility for growth? Because they're not necessarily going to have that clear career trajectory. They also might not have the we promote every 2 years. So understand, how do they treat promotions and raises? Have they thought about it? What is that mentality? If they haven't thought about it, when are they going to? And then also, will future funding rounds, if any, impact their salaries? So if they're offering a lower salary now, but they say, hey, we're going to be doing financing in 6 months, and then we're going to update, and that's going to impact it. Like, that's good to know, because things could shift a little bit more quickly. Equity is fairly common in startups, although it depends on what position you're joining in and where in the company. So the earlier you join, the more likely it is that equity is part of your package. You'll want to know, when does the equity vest? What percentage of the company is the equity equal to? Are there opportunities to gain additional shares? And then what is the strike price? How much does that cost you? And usually base salary and equity are seen as flip sides of the coin. You take on more equity to get lower base salary, or vice versa. That's not always true. And I think that there are opportunities, just as startups can vary in size, in how they compensate their employees. If you're joining early on or at the leadership level, yes, you should absolutely expect equity, but you don't necessarily have to consider joining a startup as taking a hit in your salary. Depending on where they are, your skill set, there are opportunities to look for something market rate. You might get less equity in response, or maybe you don't. The third item that I think is not talked about enough are benefits, because your package from an employer is not just your salary. And startups are, I'd say, more common to have not developed their benefits yet. So there's vacation, there's sick leave, there's 401k, there's parental leave, there's health insurance, there's a whole spectrum. And they might be great on some, less great on others. They might not have any. So think about that directly in terms of the base salary and equity, because if you're taking a cut in one of those, you also want to make sure if you're taking a cut in benefits and how that fits with your risk profile. And the important thing to know is, because things shift, ask them what benefits are offered, and then ask them if they have any plan to add benefits. So I've been in several companies where they're like, well, no one has asked before. We have a small company and everyone's getting their benefits from these places. But if that is a deal breaker for you, let's explore this. I've been in other companies that said, hey, we can't offer that now, but we are absolutely going to in 12 to 18 months. Does that work for you? So it's not just about what is on that offer sheet in the moment, but also what is their plan in the future. And then compensation is very much a personal balancing act. So I can't give any advice into how that works for you, but I do want to encourage to think of those three components as the different areas that you're juggling, and to not necessarily associate startups with one or the other. You might not get a lot of equity. You
I was
might
actually,
get a big salary. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm sorry. I was
You guys.
actually thinking of like, especially with the benefits and the extra thing that's coming with that. I always say, ask people to say, what is the growth in the company? Like, would you pay for me to learn new skills, or what is what kind of benefits you have, like in sense of, can I use like certain courses in order to improve my communication skills, or to have a LinkedIn premium, for example, or other benefits such as equipment. Like some startups, they also like pay for people equipment, like for office supplies, like and gadgets and everything. So I think that if the conversation is not like the ideal, but you still would like to work for a startup, ask like for these kind of benefits to see, okay, this is a great opportunity, and they also provide me with all this growth budget for me to become better and to develop further in my career. So I always think that the benefits and the perks are so important when it's a startup, because yes, you might not get the salary you desire, but you might get so much more from those things.
Yeah, I agree with you in part, although I'm going to push and say the benefits are important in every package, startup or otherwise, and to always ask and advocate for what you want. So like I said, that job negotiation and benefits is a whole different presentation, but absolutely they are a massive component of your offer package and should be taken seriously. And I think it's always good to ask for what you're looking for, because there might be flexibility. I would say particularly so in startups, because they're more likely to have that range of flexibility, because their structure and their administrative bones are not as solidified. And so you might be able to get concessions or to be creative in ways that you couldn't in, I would say, more formal or bureaucratic organizations. So the end note that I want to make sure that you take away is that there is a startup that fits you. The definition of a startup and the way they're approached are massively different, and can really, every configuration under the sun exists. So usually when we talk about startups, we think small, scrappy, chaotic, low salaries, high equity, working on an app. That probably defines the stereotype of a startup. That is not the be all and end all. And so when if you're interested in some of the dynamics that do come with a startup, working on front lines of innovation, having more flexibility, taking over some aspects of culture, having greater leadership, those all come into play. And if that is interesting to you, don't be shy to look for the startup that fits your needs, and use those 3 steps to really validate what your needs are and how that startup might need them, because their description and the way that they talk about themselves, that age, size, and funding, is not going to tell you everything that you need to know. So that's everything that I have for today. I know you guys have been chiming in with Q&As along the way, but I want to open the last 15 minutes we have for anything else that might come up. I'm happy to chat about them.
Oh, I have like so many things in my head, but I would love like if any of you guys, you have like the startup ecosystem and you would like to ask, please feel free, because I always have questions, but please like take them from me and ask your own questions. And you feel free also to jump on camera, off mute if you want. Lorraine has no more questions. Well, like Macaulay, I would say like if someone like starts like in a startup at this point of their career, like what would you say to someone who is starting to work for a startup, not like in a very young age? I would say like a little bit like older, because people say, oh, startups are dynamic environments, everybody's young there, everybody's like super keen, but how about people who are like in their mid 30s, 40s, even like 50s, who start in a startup?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I said, because there is such a wide variety of startups, there is definitely a room for everyone. Where I see that more coming into play is in this area of experiencing the leadership teams and administrative systems. So to use, not to throw interns under the bus, but to use this as an example, as like a mid-career professional, you probably would not want to go and work at a company where interns were in charge, because there will be some areas that are just you've grown used to as business practices, how you communicate, how you respond, what do performance reviews look like, that you have grown accustomed to and probably like, that are not going to be present. Some people have a high tolerance for that. Sometimes they don't care about the experience in the administrative system. Sometimes they want to be the one who's implementing that and shaping that. But I would think about your tolerance level for who you're engaging with and what does that look like. And if you want that level of ambiguity or that level of chaos, those I think are the bigger things, because they're not as concrete as that compensation package. That are important to understand. And yes, older professionals do get stereotyped as not liking either one of those things. I think that that's an unfair stereotype. But I do think that there are professional standards that grow as you get older that can sometimes be at conflict with younger, more informal startups. But again, there are older, well-run startups, or there are people who really like that dynamic. And so I wouldn't necessarily rule it out, but to be aware of it.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. And also we have another question here from Deidre, and she says, "I'm thinking of the differences between startups and non-startups, and I'm thinking I understand that a good part on one for someone considering a startup is to realize you as a potential employee needs to lean in more and self-advocate. Would you?"
I think yes, and I think I expand that's true to any organization that has a less formal structure. So that is more likely to be a startup than a traditional organization, but I think that you can find that anywhere. Any place where that path is not clearly laid out for you. So going back to that ambiguity, where your growth trajectory, your expectations are not clearly defined, then you are going to have to make those up as you go along. And to get them to go in the direction you want, that does involve leaning in. I think that's a great example to be applied to any sense of ambiguity, but it is more particular in startups because that ambiguity tends to be more common and just more extensive.
Yeah, exactly. Now, like we're talking about this kind of like how the startups, like the young startups, I was also thinking how to, well, the burnout is like inevitable in startups, but
Well, I'll stop you on that one, Linda, because that's a
please.
stereotype that I challenge a lot, because I do think that's a heavily touted aspect of startups. And I think that discourages a lot of people from joining or encourages bad business practices. Like a startup and burnout are not necessarily synonymous. It goes back to what does your working structure look like and your chaos. And so, yeah, if you have I think you can see it in startups in part because they have such high turnover, and you'll get a lot of flash in the pan, where startups that are incredibly chaotic or have high burnout, they might not move forward. So you are going to hear of them more often. But there is this impression that a startup means burnout. And I think that absolutely does not have to be true. Think about what your role looks like. Think about how they respond to work and what that putting out fires. But also be clear about what your boundaries are, because not engaging in burnout is a way to do that. But you have to set your professional boundaries, and that might be more common in startups, and being clear about what the expectations are, what your working hours are, because there's not that formal structure. You might have to be more proactive in doing though. But I think the impression that they're synonymous is harmful to a lot of existing startup employees, because it allows them to accept what are not necessarily positive working cultures.
I love that. I love that, like setting boundaries and working hours, because I've witnessed that in some startups, like people have to shape their roles. They're not a clear structure. They don't know their responsibilities. They just go and cover things here and there in order to keep their workflow. But like, yeah, I love that. Like setting boundaries, saying no, saying that, hey, I know this is a start, but this is my job. But I'm going to work like 8 hours. I'm going to work on my responsibilities. if I have time, I'm going to help with other responsibilities, but I have to stay focused on what I'm going to produce. Because, like, what would you say, like, to be effective with a startup? Because in the startup teams, we have like so many ideas. Like, everybody comes with ideas and ideas here, ideas there. But when it comes to implementation, everything freezes. Like, what would you say for a more effective way to implement the ideas?
I think that speaks to the level of strategy for the startup, and that really like, where you engage with them along that process. So early on, it is a lot of ideas. It is a lot of generating execution, trial and error. Startups as they get later on, and I'll use my own as an example, like we have a product that we're putting to market. There are opportunities that come up that we engage with, et cetera, but that is a primary focus. And the ability to pivot from that is not strong, nor is it desirable. So it speaks a little bit to that company strategy within that area of ambiguity. So understanding like what does their culture look like? What is their ability to pivot? Actually, it's within the chaos. So what is their ability to pivot or respond to new opportunities? The further along they go into one idea, the less likely they are going to be to, I'd say, to bounce around. Pivoting is still possible. I mean, it's possible in every organization. But the farther they go along their strategy, ideally, the less likely they are going to be pulled in different directions. I absolutely agree with you in terms of the working hours and the setting boundaries. And I think that speaks to both the startups might be more inclined to have that be challenging or have or make it more proactive on benefit of the employee because their structures might not be as strongly in place. So that speaks to managerial structures. It speaks to working hour structures. Like one of the great things about flexibility, and flexibility is great, is you can make up some things and your rules as the way you go. But it also means that you don't have bumpers or boundaries for what is considered normal or not. Also means the ambiguity. So if you're trying to define your role, it is easy to bite off a little bit more than you can chew. And so that's something to think about when you're thinking about assessing your own tolerance for role flexibility and ambiguity is how will I set those boundaries? What does that look like for me? And how does that impact my work-life balance?
Yeah, thank you so much. That is like so helpful. And what I was thinking is because you were talking about flat hierarchies or no hierarchies at all, but as you said that they are out there, like it's like we cannot avoid them but happening. What would you say would be the best way to understand uh, to whom people have to report to? Like, what is the dynamic look like in the startup? Like, how people can actually identify these people that they have to report to?
Yeah, so I'm going to toss that question back because that should be a question that you're asking when you're exploring the startup because it's going to change. I can't give you an answer, but I will say that you'll want to understand that dynamic. And if they can't tell you that formal dynamic, ask them to tell you informally who else is going to be working on that task with you, generally how decisions are made. And if they can't tell you that, then start to think about whether or not they understand how they're making their own decisions. But that would be important to know. It's also going to be important because you're going to want to know who your teammates are. Particularly in smaller teams, when you come into close contact, like that becomes a more critical feature than if you have a large distributed team. I saw a question as well. Someone interested in a new work environment begin with their passion for an idea or a product rather than their skill set. I think that is a very personal question, is about whether or not you follow your passion or you follow your skill set, and depends on what you're looking for in that moment. There are a lot of factors, like what does the market look like? How qualified are you for your passion, or how easy will it be for you to get involved? I will say personally, I've enjoyed work more when I care about what is being produced. Like that is a really critical factor for me in employment. But I also understand that for some people, given the time that they are in their lives, like the compensation package might be a bigger priority, and that's fine. And it's useful to just balance and figure out what are the 2 or 3 driving factors for the job search, and recognize that might shift over time. You might be more likely to take a pay cut and work on something really exciting at one stage in your life, and then later on say, nope, I'm actually not going to take that really exciting one. I'm going to take something that has a larger compensation package or is less chaotic, gives me better work-life balance. There isn't a right way to go about that, and that's not unique to startups either.
And like Macaulay, like what would you suggest? Like people who work in the startup, what kind of advice would you give them to actually implement this work and life balance? Because sometimes, we can go off. Some of us, like me, I get overexcited and I might like think about ideas what I'm going to do the next day, and it's like 12 in the night and I'm still working. I can't put those boundaries. Like what would you suggest for us, like we're like a little bit more overexcited?
Oh, that's a loaded question, Linda, with only 4 minutes to spare. But I can share some of the like mini best practice for that, because work-life balance is very culture specific and is a large topic, particularly in the US, which is where my work has been based. Although I don't think it's unique to the US. I think that it's important to recognize boundaries and to identify what is being asked of you versus what you are doing proactively, because those are going to require different solution sets. So if your company is demanding or asking for deliverables that take you 80 hours a week, that's different than you putting in 40 hours and doing an additional 40 because you feel like you have to, or you want to, or you get excited, because those require different strategies. The former requires talking to your company about your bandwidth, about what that looks like, about getting expectations. The latter means maybe changing some of your own habits, maybe turning off your email or switching off your notifications, or changing your thought process about when you need to be available. I will say that I think that there is a larger pervasive attitude of being irreplaceable within a company, within an organization. I think that it makes everyone feel good to know that they are needed and to think that they are irreplaceable. But I think the flip side of that coin is that if you are irreplaceable, it means that you are on demand for a lot of things. And it is challenging to not be on call or to go away. So delegating is a skill. Delegating is a skill. Setting boundaries is a skill. And I think that those are not focused on as much. And understand how well you do in those and how you can implement them better is really important.
Thank you so much. Like you have honestly inspired me this day, because now I keep all these notes like in my head and like, okay, I have to take it easy. I have to delegate. Lorraine too, she's also inspired. So in these 2 minutes that we are remaining, please feel free to share everyone like your LinkedIn and Macaulay, like, where people can find you and connect with you.
Yes. So thank you everyone for your questions and for being here. I really appreciate it. My LinkedIn, I believe, was shared in the meeting invite. If not, I am the only Macaulay Kenny on LinkedIn. Please feel free to search for me, reach out. I'm happy to chat with you about this subject or others within the startup community. And I'm always happy to support the Power to Fly community. Oh, Linda, you are on mute.
It always, I don't know who always happens the last moment. The moment when I say like my thank you and my appreciation, something happens. But thank you everybody who are here today. I know like it's noon and it's like only like Wednesday. So have a great continue of your week and stress less, set boundaries. And there is out there the great starter fit for you. And I'm so happy that Macaulay today, she walked us through that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Linda. Pleasure to be here.
Goodbye, everybody.